So welcome to this weekend, which is called Transcendence. The things that we're doing, I think, are kind of quite unique, and especially in the world of NLP, which we're usually teaching in. And they kind of focus on not just making personal changes, but on collective or community-wide change. And sometimes that's thinking about what can we do in the community, and sometimes it's thinking about the community of the world that's inside you as a result of your experiences and all the things that you've inherited from that community. Now, we're kind of focused in New Zealand right now, but we have people from all across the world. Because we're focused in Aotearoa in New Zealand, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with what's called a karakia. And karakia just means a chant, and this is a traditional chant. And to explain a little bit about the actual words of it, this is a chant that would be chanted when Maori sailors were launching a canoe. So that's a kind of a metaphor in itself, that this is like a waka, a canoe. Waka actually means anything from canoe to ocean liner ship. And so I'm going to play the words in Maori, and you can see the translation into English down the bottom. So it's a kind of like these people, as they are launching the canoe, they're coordinating their actions, and they are kind of, there's more detail someone may be able to tell you. I'm not Maori, so I'm kind of reporting a story from another culture here, but this is the place where that culture lives. So that's how come we're doing it. And so it's kind of a nice way to start and to use these metaphorical descriptions of joining together and gathering. And at the end here, when you get to this place, this last line, often people, you can unmute yourself, and often people, they say this last line together because the people launching the ship would need to be doing coordinated action at that time. It says, haumie, huie, taikie. So join, gather, intertwine, and they're actually descriptive of actions they're doing as they launch the ship. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to
Whakataka te hao ki te uru, whakataka te hao ki te tonga, kia makina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai, e hia ke ana te atākura he tio, he huka, he hauhunga, haumie, huie, taikie.
Okay, so we are launching. So I want to tell you a little bit about this training and where it comes from, and my hope is that you can adjust your screen so you can see this behind me here, and that means that I can keep smiling at you, and I don't have to sort of reduce myself and show you. I do have this on a slide if you wanted to see that, but here is what we're doing on this weekend. So firstly, we're going to learn two processes which are new NLP processes that none of you have actually learned officially as a kind of a training process have learned to do before. And that's because one of them I modeled, which means I adjusted it to make it fit with NLP presuppositions. And the other one was developed by Yulia Kuroshiva, who will actually be here to talk about how that happened. And so these are two entirely new processes that you will get to practice and then be able to take other people through. And both of them have this quality with them of linking you into the collective background of what goes on. And if you work with clients, you know that that's an issue with almost every client that you're dealing with. If you work individually with people, what they're going to tell you is, well, yeah, I think this happened because, this is the pressure on my family, or the things that are going on in my job, or this is the way I grew up, so they're continuously talking about the people around them, the systems around them. And even though NLP, for example, is based on the idea that everything is made up of systems, I'm surprised how minimally we usually deal with those systems when we're working with our clients. So that's the kind of focus of what we're doing here, is to add in much more of that. We're going to enhance, I believe it's the right word, your response to social conflict and collective challenges in the world today. And so you don't have to read the newspapers or read Facebook to realize that we don't live in a sort of magical, perfect world. There are various challenges, conflicts around the world, and many of those are kind of pretty serious. And over the last 30 years, I've kind of been working with people in different places around the world, especially in crisis areas. So I've been working, Yulia and I have been teaching, for example, over the last year and a half in Ukraine online to people in Ukraine and people in Eastern Europe who are coping with refugees from the war in Ukraine, the invasion in Ukraine. And so that's just an example, though, of these crises. And usually I sort of feel like, well, this is pretty important stuff to teach people how to be resilient, how to recover from disturbing experiences that they've had in those kind of crises. And in a way, what I'm doing when I do that is really putting an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So it's kind of like the collective crisis pushes people over the cliff, and here we are at the bottom teaching them how to recover and how to be resilient and pick themselves up and carry on. And so I believe that it's possible to do something better with that. Now, the kind of stuff that I'm doing here, I just want to acknowledge one of the sources that it comes from. So it's actually described in more detail in this book. Let me hold it up separate from there. Okay, Transcendence. There you go. So it's described in this book. It's described in the Transcendence Guidebook, which I don't even have copies yet. And one of the places where these things that we're doing here, I first learned is in a workshop that some of you have actually been to in New Zealand, which is a workshop on the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which was a treaty signed between two different social groups in New Zealand. So between the original people of New Zealand, the Maori, and the colonists who were hoping to be able to, and through this treaty got permission to arrive over from Britain and eventually other places around the world. And so I have been running a training which is to help people consider what do we do about that treaty. And that treaty training I ran for teachers, I ran for nurses, and so I started doing that about 35 years ago. And so I've run that many, many times. And we have a lot of research about that and about similar processes around the world. Now, I know that some of you have done some similar sort of things. So working in groups, dealing with some kind of social disagreement or some social difference. And so we do have some research showing that that's useful, that actually works. And there are things that make it work and things that make it more difficult to work. And just to explain that, by the way, since we're going to be doing that, enhancing your social response in those kind of challenging situations, one of the things that makes it work is understanding that biases are just part of being human. You know, like people have different opinions and biases as a result of their past, and it's not something that just bad people have. You know, that's something I've been running a training over the last couple of years on cognitive clarity, and that is about being able to detect biases in other people's thinking and help them to choose which biases they want to go with and which biases they want to let go of in a situation. And so one of the things that's really clear there is that all of us are biased, and that's the way human nature is. Human beings are meant to be biased. They're meant to focus on some things, not on others. They're meant to sort of like the people who are closest to them. And as long as we know that bias is there, then we can work out how to use it effectively. And so that's one of the things that makes these trainings successful, is understanding that it's not that there are some bad people who are biased and we're trying to be the good ones who are unbiased or something like that. So what has happened in the world, of course, through history is that there have been some major conflicts as a result of, like wars, as a result of people's biases not being adequately dealt with. And so these things that we're going to do over this weekend are actually, many of them are community healing processes. And that means that you could use them in running a training like the training on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And thank you, Aroha, for mentioning Robert and Joanna, who are my friends who actually wrote this book in Otautahi in Christchurch. And so we actually ran this training together at the College of Education there and the nursing course there. And then I trained instructors for that training. So this kind of training is useful in terms of conflict between different cultural groups. It's useful in conflict between wealthy people and impoverished people. It's useful in conflict between people who have been at whose countries have been at war. Some of you know the story of the famous training that Alexander Papadieros ran in the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. And that was a training that he organized where he brought German people over to Crete and combined German people with Cretan people. And this was immediately after the Second World War, when there, of course, had been this massive conflict. So that was a highly successful conflict resolution training. And the ripples from that kind of training, we know from the research, they spread out beyond the people who are actually at the training. So I think of this as being something we're doing not just for ourselves individually, what we're doing right now. We're doing this in a way that will spread out from us and be useful to the world. That's my hope. As they would say in Egypt, inshallah, this will have more of an effect than just the effect on us here. So in doing this, I'm starting already telling you some of the science and the systems theory behind this sort of stuff. How does this work? So we have, I'll talk about this later on, we have now a couple of different research studies about doing NLP processes with people and then monitoring the NLP style processes and then monitoring the effects on their epigenetics. So genetics is the instructions for producing the chemistry of the body, and epigenetics are instructions on top of those instructions that are added as a result, for example, of distressing events. When someone has a traumatic event, then they add on instructions that say release these chemicals, don't release these ones. For example, in that case, the world is too dangerous, so you've got to be on alert all the time. And that epigenetic set of instructions is then passed on to their children and continuously for many, many generations afterwards. And the other side of that story is that when we do a set of processes, and I'll talk about this later on a bit more, then we can check the epigenetics and see that it's changed. Every cell in their body has changed as a result of those processes. And so there are two really clear research studies showing that now. It's my expectation that will happen over this weekend here, and that probably many of the things that you're doing already help that to happen. And so it's really useful for us to know that, to know the science behind this. And one of the reasons is because the reason for doing NLP processes, healing processes, is not just to feel better yourself, but because our grandchildren deserve it, because the world deserves it, because our civilization depends on it. If we want human beings to survive over the next hundreds of years, we depend on having this ability to heal our genome, to actually not just heal us individually, but to make sure that our children are born with what we thought they were originally, a kind of a clean slate. So today I want to talk a little bit about crisis and resilience. I want to hand over to Yulia, who is a certified havening instructor, and I know that some of the people who are at this initial training have done havening already, and she's going to take us through self-havening. And self-havening, well, Yulia, do you want to tell them how that would be useful to them even now?
I absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Very quickly. So, so havening is some of you are trained, as Richard mentioned, and I'm a certified havening techniques trainer. I'm not going to train people, but I'm going to show how to use havening, self-havening, as a self-soothing tool on this training, because during these 2 days we will be exploring the origins of collective trauma as well as collective healing, and some of this material might be triggering in certain ways. Of course, of course, nothing would ever trigger us here because we're very advanced and highly evolved and totally invincible NLP trained folk peeps. But just in case, if someone might get triggered by any chance and would like to regulate heightened emotions, then I will be introducing havening, so that as you are going through some material and something is kind of icky, uncomfortable, then you can immediately apply some of the havening, and I will explain what it is a bit later. And the other reason for introducing self-havening here is that when you are guiding one another in groups of 2 or 3 people, then havening touch, which is one of the basic elements of havening techniques, havening touch very elegantly and very easily combines with NLP-based techniques. Just fantastic as a self-soothing touch, really. And so my experience, since I am trained about 3-4 years ago in it, is that it just mixes so well with NLP-based techniques. Just marvelous. Not with everyone, but with about 80% of NLP techniques that can be mixed. So two reasons there for self-regulating if you find the need, and for if you decide whether you're being guided or whether you are guiding another person, then you can bring this element into the NLP-based processes.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, and so also today I want to talk a little bit about social inequality, a little bit about culture and things here. These are subjects that I used to teach when I was teaching nurses. I used to teach sociology, and I'm not aiming to sort of give you a sociology background or something like that, but I want to give you some simple jargon that is used, and to give you an idea how things like, for example, the word racism, some of these words that people throw around as if they were just kind of insults, how they're used in sociology, in the kind of actual research into these things. And intersectionality, and some fancy words that you'll see being discussed sometimes on Facebook. And these words have become kind of hot issues in the world, especially in the United States. I notice at present a lot of people hear these words and get upset about them. Intersectionality means that sometimes there'll be some situations in your life where you have advantages because you are the kind of person who, for example, if you speak English on this planet, you have advantages, and unfair advantages. I mean, in the sense that this is the established international language, in quotes. And that may not be immediately obvious to you, but actually for someone who doesn't have English as one of their languages, it's a really frustrating thing for them sometimes. On the other hand, most of us in the training here will have some situations where they have a disadvantage because of some social process. For example, being a woman in the world today, I think we could argue is a disadvantage in certain ways because of the social structure that is kind of very that is set up to make certain things easier for men than for women. And I know that varies from country to country, but I think that sweeping generalization is still true. So the intersectionality means you may have some places where things are an advantage to you, and some places where things are a disadvantage to you. And sometimes people have 2 or 3 of these disadvantages accumulated, And it's really useful for other people to know about that, to understand that. So I'm going to talk some more about that later on today, about what happens in those situations. Because when you're working with clients, for example, they don't necessarily have all of this jargon, but they experience it. And sometimes they look around and they think, well, how come it's so easy for him, let's say, and how come I'm finding it so hard? What the hell is wrong with me? And the answer is that quite possibly nothing's wrong, man. You know, like the world is set up so that he actually has enormous advantages. He's like sort of set up kilometers ahead of you at the start of this game. And that's actually an empowering thing, because it means, okay, well, in that context, it's pretty awesome what I'm doing, for example. So that kind of inequality happens around the world as well. We're sitting here talking from several different countries, and there's an inequality of opportunity between people from different countries around the world. I'm very aware of that when I run training in different countries around the world. That if I run a training in Japan, for example, people don't blink at paying a price that in some other places where I run training, people would think, well, you know, no one could afford to go to that training. So that's kind of interesting, and it leads us into this IFS process. So we're going to do that later on today. IFS means internal family systems, and this is a process developed by a guy called Dick Schwartz, and his process has, at first glance, it has a very NLP feeling to it, because he talks about the parts inside of people. And there are some things that IFS people can learn by knowing NLP as well, because I think we have some elegant, useful ways of understanding parts. And there are some things we can learn from IFS. So that was one of my interests in studying IFS, was to work out how could we take some of this into NLP. So I want to show you the basic idea of IFS, working with internal family systems. And I think it's a really exciting expansion to what we can do with NLP. So that's going to be useful to you personally, as well as to anyone that you work with, I believe. Now tomorrow we're going to do I'm going to take you through some other things that I do on those treaty education, tiriti or waitangi education days, and I'm going to show you some processes that are officially kind of sociometry. Sociometry just means measuring things by where people are in relation to each other, actually in the group that you're learning with. I'm going to give you some experiences to understand polarization. So polarization is another jargon word that you'll hear a lot on the news and so on. And the idea here is that sometimes people are only hearing a particular slant on what's going on in the world, and when two people meet together and they have heard completely different slants, then instead of being able to talk about it and agree on what's happened and agree on what we should do, as they talk, they sort of feel like they're getting further and further apart. So they kind of feel like, how could someone possibly believe what this person believes, let alone have the ideas? And I want to show you in experiential terms how that happens. So when I say experientially, I'm going to get you to do some processes from which we will then be able to learn. So rather than just me telling you some theory. And this is not the first time I've done this, because on the Treaty of Education, on the Treaty of Waitangi education process, then I'm doing that as well. So for those of you who've done that training with me, you've done some of these experiences as well. But I want to show you how you can take those experiences and use them with clients, use them with training groups that you're in, and use them in work groups that you're in as well. So my aim is not only that we do this training here, but that you can kind of model from me what I'm doing here and take it other places. I know I have a plan for trainers training as well, where I sort of certify people to run this training here. And this training itself shows you how to take out processes and use them in other groups. So it's not just for working with individual clients. So part of that will be doing what's called systems analysis. And that has different meanings in the world, but in this case, it's going to mean looking at a social group that you're part of and working out what's going on in this group and how could you influence it. So you'll notice that if you're in a group and you try and get things to change in your work group or your family or your some social group that you belong to or your community or your country, that it can't be done in a straight line, because as you do something, you get pushback from other people in the group, and you start to realize, oh my goodness, this is a system. I can't explain this to you if you don't understand this other thing. I can't get your agreement if I don't have the agreement of these other people that you work with. That's what I mean by a system, where all the different parts connect together. So tomorrow I want to show you how to do a systems analysis and work out in systems terms, how can we hack into this and get things to change effectively in a system. And part of that, is understanding that it is the system that we're facing most of the time. It's not just an individual person who is a bad person or something like that. It's actually that there is a system that kind of makes that happen. And I want to show you, to give you a sense of what I mean by experiential and to give you a sense of what I mean by systems, I want to show you a metaphor that I'm sure you've heard of before. Here I have a jar, and I'm going to ask you to imagine something. Inside the jar, I actually have some little objects, but I'm going to pretend they're something else. I'm going to pretend that what they are is red ants and black ants. And so immediately some of you know the story that I'm going to tell you. So these are red ants and black ants, and they're inside the jar here. And they've got, you see, they're sitting on some food, and so they're very happy, red ants and black ants. And what happens is, in this little metaphor, is I shake up the jar. And when I shake up the jar, well, you'd think that would mix up the red ants and the black ants, but actually what it does is it separates them out so that the red ants are on one side and the black ants are on the other. Now, why does that happen? It happens because the red ants think the black ants have been shaking the jar. And the black ants think the red ants have been shaking the jar. And they then begin to fight. Before that, they were quite happy. They knew they had food, everything's okay. And there's no reason why they should even notice who's a red ant and who's a black ant. Now, I just want to reassure you that this story is not from David Attenborough, who you'll see accredited to online frequently. And I really have this passion for finding out where did things really come from. It actually comes from a novel, this story, a novel by Kurt Vonnegut. And in this novel, someone explains, what's happening is, it's like we're ants in a jar, red ants and black ants, and someone has been shaking the jar, and we end up fighting each other. And what we need to do is work out who the hell is shaking the jar and stop them doing that stuff. And it's only a metaphor. It's not actually a research study, right? So I just want to make it clear, no one has actually sat around and shaken 100 jars of ants to see if they always fight each other or something like that. It's just a damn story. But it's kind of a cool story, right? And here's the thing about it, though, is that most people don't understand how dramatic this story is. Because, you see, the thing is that in the real situation in the world, you'd think, okay, well, this proves that we're fighting each other and we should unite against that nasty person who's shaking the jar. But what you need to understand is in the real world, the person who's shaking the jar is also inside a jar. You got it? And they're being shaken around as well by the bigger system around them. And outside of that, there might be the real bad person. No, I'm afraid that's another jar. Do you see how this works? And this is really important to understand. If you want to stop this fight, you've got to understand what are the kind of layers of jars that you're dealing with here. And actually, you need to track it all the way to the source. And that is what we're going to do in this final process here. So that is what transcendence is. And it's a process where we start off with someone's individual challenge, and then we track it to its source. And this, Yulia, do you want to briefly, that's okay? So, because Yulia developed this process, you see, and in a really cool way, a really, really cool way, which is very aligned with.
I'll quickly say how, and then you explain the actual process then. So I didn't like brainstorm the process. I didn't think about how to do it. It came out naturally. I was very distressed on the day. I thought I poisoned our cat with Lily's stuff, and I was probably underslept. I was super distressed. And so once I washed the cat and I couldn't do anything else, I literally like flopped, and I thought I will work with my shamanic guides. So I do shamanic work, and I thought I just not able to do anything cognitive. I'll just kind of surrender myself to my shamanic guides. And so then next thing that I know, I'm kind of just like being placed in my mind somewhere. And then this process occurred. So I went through the layers of the process and then came back. And very cognitively afterwards, I understood that, okay, we had been talking with Richard about collective trauma. So there are some links. My mind might have been primed. The shamanic links to the process are obvious to me. It's a little bit similar to co-transformation process that I'm a trainer of as well, and that we teach. It's a little bit similar to how Richard teaches Robert Dilt's process aligning neurological levels. So there are some similarities, but in the way that it was kind of that I went through it, it did not exist. And to make sure that I didn't exist when I emerged from it, I thought I will ask Richard, because I have no idea what is this that just occurred. So I went to Richard and I told him that's what just happened, like a shamanic journey of this very structured kind. And Richard said, that's it. That's the process. That's like the culmination of the work that Richard had been doing for a year, probably. For half a year, studying the collective trauma and thinking about writing the book and creating the workshops. These elements I was not aware of. So, yes. So in that sense, I really think that it's emerged from me surrendering myself, because I was really distressed, and asking shamanic guides for help. And that's what occurred. It was very effective as well for myself. Straight away after that, I guided Richard through it so that we know that it works. And so I'm immensely grateful to, I don't know, to the universe, of course, in many ways. But I also would like to acknowledge that my brain was primed, sensitized to overall ideas of that, and that I can also cognitively make links with other sources. Yes.
Thank you. So, so that's the second NLP style process that we'll do. And now you have, maybe in a little way, I didn't get you to discuss something and then learn from it. But when I showed you the ants in the jar, in a little way, you get the idea of what I mean by a kind of a metaphorical process. So we actually know from the research as well that metaphorical processes, like I did with this jar, they actually make a difference. So, for example, in some very famous research, what they do is they get people to write down their problem, and they have people who are very distressed about something, had a traumatic experience, and half the people, they just hand in the paper they've written it down on, and half the people fold the paper in three, and they put it into an envelope, and they hand that envelope in, and then afterwards they interview them to find out how is their distress rating out of 10. And what happens is the people, of course, they're in two separate rooms, so they actually think that what's being studied is, does writing your problem down make a difference? What's really being studied is, does folding it up and putting it in an envelope make a difference? So, of course, to check that it's none of the other things, they got them to write. They had other groups where they got people to write down something good and fold it up and put it in an envelope and so on. And what they determined is writing the problem and folding it up into an envelope is what makes the difference. That's the sequence that actually reduces their anxiety. Now, that is purely a metaphorical experience. So it's not a real experience. It doesn't actually apparently do anything in the real world to write down your problem and put it in an envelope. But your brain thinks it does. So your brain is not thinking rationally all the time. It's designed to understand things metaphorically, and it responds to that specific experience in a specific way. And this, by the way, it has been understood throughout history. So one of my trainings is I'm trained as an archaeologist, and one of the things that archaeologists look at is what in human history is predictably human. And one of the things we find is that these kind of rituals that embody something in a collective ritual especially, these are powerful healing events for all human beings. They occur in all human societies. And if anything, what's happened in the last 100 years is we stripped away our collective healing rituals. So these kind of symbolic activities that we do that were associated with religious traditions, for example, we have taken them away, and people know, well, that's just a religious thing. It's really just been built up over the centuries, so it may not be anything real, and therefore they don't do those collective rituals anymore. They don't go so frequently to the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the temple, and nothing has replaced it. And partly what we're doing here on this weekend, my aim is to bring us back in alignment with the history of humanity and start thinking, how do we create collective rituals that can heal distress? Because distress is not individual, it's collective, and this is something that our ancestors have understood from the dawn of time. So that's an overview of where we're headed with the course. And let me just briefly say a little bit as well before I turn it over to you. I'm going to get you to introduce yourselves. We have a small enough group where we can do that. And I want to sort of explain this set of agreements here that I usually have when I'm teaching a course, and that I'm going to have here. And the first thing on the set of agreements is that let's agree that it's okay to learn. And okay to learn means if you didn't understand something and you want to understand it, you're actually allowed to write and say, what the heck? What was that about? I have no idea, what you just said. What was that word? What does it even mean? Can you say that again? Because I was paying attention to the cat that was climbing onto me at that time, or something like that. So actually, it's okay to ask questions, not to know stuff. It's okay to learn. That's all. That's how learning happens, and you need to be able to do that. The second thing is that when we do an exercise, to the best of your ability, I'm going to ask you to follow the instructions, and that is partially because we're dealing with sometimes sensitive issues. And you might think, I'm a pretty together person, like Julia said, like we're all above all that stuff. What I want you to know is if I don't, at some point on this weekend, push a button that's significant to you, then somehow I forgot to do everything. Because really, this is emotionally significant. We're human beings. We live with other human beings, and as we say in New Zealand and Australia, shit has happened, so that's the way it is. So safety with exercises means follow the instructions so that you're doing it in what I think from my experience before is the safest way. Being at cause means taking care of your emotional response, and that is partially why Yulia is going to show you the self-havening process, is because we want you to, regardless of what we've suggested, to look after yourself. So if you need to take a moment and kind of recover, if you need to say, I need to step out of this exercise, you're in charge. And it's really important for you to be able to look after yourself. Self-havening gives you an ability to do that while carrying on with the process. Confidentiality means that people are going to tell you stuff that they would rather you didn't tell other people. And just treat them like you treat any good friend. When a good friend tells you something personal, you don't write it on Facebook and tell the world. You actually ask their permission before you tell someone else. So that's all I mean by confidentiality, is treat the rest of us like your friends. And listen to people. We're going to practice with that as well. So that means instead of thinking that each of us is here to convince the other person of something, we're going to have different opinions. So we do actually need to, that's part of what we're learning to do, is to listen to each other. The timing is going to go from 10 o'clock in New Zealand time. We're going to have 3.5 hours in what for me is going to be the morning, and 3.5 hours in what for me is going to be the afternoon. So you need to add up from we started 45 minutes ago, so you need to add up from there. And in the morning and in the afternoon, there will generally be 2 10-minute pauses. So 2 10-minute pauses in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. Okay, so we're coming up to that now. Before we do, though, what I'd like to do is I'm going to step out from the videoing part of the training, and I'm going to invite us to introduce ourselves. And since I've just said a little bit about what we're going to be dealing with here, I think it would be really cool when we introduce ourselves. And by the way, for most parts of humanity, this is how people introduce themselves anyway. If we don't just say individually who we are, but tell us a little bit about, like, where do you come from? You know, like maybe you might want to say where you're beaming in from now. Where in the world are you? Where do your ancestors come from? Where do your family come from? We don't need your life story right now because we're only planning to take a couple of minutes each. But like basically, who are you in the sense of what jars have you been shaken up in? So let me give you an example of that first of all, and then I'll turn over to you. So I'm Richard, and I'm coming from New Zealand here, Aotearoa, and I think we're in the process of gradually changing to calling it both those things. And so my family actually come, almost all the people in my sort of extended family come from Europe originally. So they come from places like Norway and from Wales in Great Britain, and from Poland. And so I didn't know that until I got the genetics checked. But, you know, we all have skeletons in the cupboard. So that was part of what I discovered is, wow, you know, I have 17% of my DNA comes from Poland, and I had no idea. And here I've been teaching in Poland all these years. Way cool. So that means I am part of a colonial adventure. You know, like the last couple of 100 years, people moved across from the other side of the world to here. And we're just kind of working out, wow, what do we do about that then? You know, because like if we were back then 200 years ago, we probably would have thought it was uncool, some of the stuff that happened. So I'm really interested in that. I've been really interested in this collective healing for a long time. As you can hear with the Treaty of Waitangi workshops, I had for quite a time I was working as well in a group called, I know it sounds intense, but Men Against Rape. So this is a group trying to educate men about their collective responsibility for men's violence against women. And so that's been a part of my history of interest in this stuff as well. And I'm really excited to bring some of that experience into the NLP world. That's me. So that, I think, was probably a couple of minutes. This is something I've taught to first responders, people like firemen. In Poland, for example, I was teaching the fire service there. And Yulia and I have taught resilience skills to people who are in Ukraine. And on those occasions, sometimes we were dealing with people, for example, who actually, as we're talking, I'm speaking in English that's being translated into Russian, the lingua franca, the usual language of the area. And in the background of the translator, there are the sounds of automatic gunfire and bombs and so on. And then we realize, okay, that's the situation here. So everyone is right in the war zone. And what Yulia is going to show you, she actually taught them there and produced this dramatic effect in people who were right there, essentially just a kilometer from the battlefield. So it's a very real thing what we're teaching. We're not just teaching kind of the philosophy of what makes people resilient. The research on resilience is worldwide, and so this is not an NLP term or something I made up. It's the term used by the American Psychological Association and so on. And what we find, though, is that when we look at the research, there are a couple of things that create a more resilient response to a crisis. A crisis just means things were going along and they seemed okay, and then suddenly something weird happened. So life is going to bring that to you regardless of your background. So there are going to be times when things are even, and then times when something surprising happens that you didn't anticipate and that is challenging. And birth was the first one that you may not remember it, but it was a crisis, definitely. And things had been going along quite nicely for a few months, and then suddenly, boom. So that kind of crisis, it turns out the first thing that makes it successful for people to respond to crisis is that they have friends and family. So connection with other human beings is, in all of the research, the number one factor that decides whether people respond resiliently. And I always say when I'm teaching individual resilience, which means nothing that I'm about to show you how to do makes any difference if you don't have good relationships where you can hug someone, stuff like that. In a way that kind of is going to link into what Yulia's saying, because in fact, one of the things that tells your body that you have friends there is that you actually, you get touch, you have physical contact with a human being. So friends and family is really the number one factor. And then the other thing that we know is a significant factor in resilience is your past experience. So again, we can't do something about that immediately. We can only do things that de-traumatize a person. So when someone has had bad experiences before, they are more likely to have challenges in a new crisis. So you'd think that if you've had bad experiences before, that should make you stronger. As Nietzsche's famous statement, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, says. But turns out Nietzsche was talking through a hole in his head. And actually, the reality is that when people have had lots of bad experiences, their brain figures, so it's going to be like that again, huh? And so it doesn't calm down afterwards, because it gets the idea, okay, this is a regular thing. So the other things, though, that we find are resilient, I can describe them essentially as being NLP. So everything you learned in NLP, that is resilient skills. People who are resilient set goals, not grandiose, I'm going to be a millionaire sort of goals, but just simple, what am I going to do today and how will I check that I've actually done it? So people who are less resilient, they don't think so much about the future at all. They think, what if bad things happen in the future? And they think, why did this happen to me? So they do a different kind of thinking that focuses them on what's wrong, and that eventually they start talking about the way they feel as a problem, as a thing that is wrong with them. I have depression, I have anxiety, I have chronicity, which is the term I use for this. But what I'm showing you is that this so-called chronicity or depression or anxiety is produced by these first couple of things. It's produced by thinking about what could go wrong and by thinking, why did this happen? Because resilient people aren't doing that. Instead, they're thinking, what's my goal? And how can I think about this in a way that's useful? How can I get something useful out of what's happening right now? They're reminding themselves of positive experiences. That is, they're using what NLP calls anchors that remind them of positive experiences. And they step back and they see the bigger picture, which is literally what we're going to do a lot of on this weekend. So actually, people who are resilient have an idea, okay, this is a tough time, but it's part of a bigger story. And people who have chronicity are focused in on the worst parts of what's just happened. And at those times, they don't feel like they can do anything about it, which was kind of true. If they were in an earthquake, as the earthquake's happening, it for a while there, it increasingly gets worse and more out of control. And the thing that produces chronic problems, that produces what we might call a traumatized response, is not just that bad things happened, but that the person felt they couldn't control it. So it's an identity level challenge that produces this longer term damage. Whereas in fact, resilient people, their bigger picture is that this was just one challenge and it's part of a larger event. So part of resilience, of course, is being able to reconnect this experience now with the bigger picture and with positive meanings and positive memories. And that reconnecting most of all happens while you're sleeping. And so that's an interesting thing. You can prime it while you're awake, but it's going to happen mostly while you sleep. I'm just running through what I usually take 2 days to teach in resilience training in 10 minutes. And basically, here is a kind of little map of the brain. I don't know if you can see that clearly here. The front is this way, the back is this way. There's a red thing here, it's called the amygdala, and a blue thing here, it's called the hippocampus. In your brain, they're not really red and blue, they're just brain colored. And these places here are where your temporary memory is stored. So when you have an experience, whether it's a crisis experience or not, it's stored first of all here. The amygdala is a place where it assesses how serious is this, how important is this for you, either positively, like is there something exciting here, is there yummy food, is there sex available. I'm afraid your amygdala's got no morals, it's just interested in keeping you alive and having babies. So it assesses whether it's positively important or negatively important, like does it hurt, does it frighten you? And the hippocampus stores the details of the memory. And so it stores where you were, what the time was, what you were seeing, and so on. And as you sleep, those memories are transferred out to the cortex and they're connected with all your other memories. And when that happens, when you have the ability to connect this perhaps disturbing memory with all other memories, your brain realizes, well, I've got other choices for how I deal with this. I've got other ways I could have coped that I didn't remember at the time. And that process of reconsolidating the memory out into the cortex is what actually enables you to recover, usually, as long as you do that resilient way of thinking about it. And so, as I say, something that happens most of all when you're sleeping or when your mind is still, because it requires transferring information out to the rest of the brain. And so what havening does and what other processes that are able ultimately to be used to reduce the chances of a traumatic experience happening, what they actually do is they help this reconsolidation of memory. So they allow for the brain to organize memories differently and to calm down the rating in the amygdala. So that's kind of a bit of the most simple neuroscience behind what Yulia's about to tell you about.